Thank you. Now we continue our videos. This next video is projects with land acquisition. So what documents are required when requesting funds to purchase property? Remember, this also includes donated property. So we'll review the process for land acquisition through the Parks and Recreation Trust Fund, talk about the steps and timeline to take title to the property, discuss if someone wants to donate property to your community, and then what you need to know about other legal or other documentation required for the application or after the grant is awarded. There are certain methods to acquire property. The first is fee simple. That is outright purchase for the fair market value of a piece of property. The price is based on a recent appraisal. You have a bargain sale, and that's when the property owner agrees to sell the land at a price below the fair market value. And in that situation, keep in mind that the amount of difference between the selling price and the fair market value may be considered a donation, and donated value may be used as part of your match. So for example, a bargain sale, if they're going to sell it, if the property appraises at $500,000, but they're going to sell it to you for $250,000, then that's a $250,000 difference between the selling price and fair market value. And you can use that $250,000 as part of your match. So that's very important. And similarly, donated property, so that's a full donation where the property owner deeds over the property. And keep in mind, in this case, the donor must be a private individual or an organization. Example organizations might be a land trust, for example. The value of the property is established by an appraisal, and again, it may be used as a match. Required donation, that's a term you'll see, and that's when land is conveyed due to a statute or a rule. You may have a land dedication ordinance, for example, in your community. This is not a donation that may be used acceptable as a match, so on the value. You can certainly use it. You can certainly take title to it. PARTF funds can be used to develop recreation facilities on these type of properties. It might be part of your whole, as you're taking maybe property, various properties for one site. Some of it may be required donation. But again, you can have title to it. The local government must have title or at least a long-term lease of at least 25 years if you want PARTF to fund development on that parcel. So when do you take title to the land? If you're going to do an acquisition project, do not take ownership of the property prior to the project period. The project period is when after the grant is awarded and a contract is signed and executed by the division and the local government. So that's typically in the fall. So the whole could be a year or 2 years out. So November the following year is the typical start date. So talk with your RRS consultant because eligible expenses for PARTF must occur during the project period. So you have a 3-year period to complete the grant. That project period is listed on your contract, and acquisition includes is one of those expenses. So taking title prior to the grant award or the contract period means that the property expense has occurred and the cost or the value of the property is ineligible for PARTF. So this is very important, not only for your application, but especially if it's donated property, because you're using the value of that donation as your match. If you take property before the contract period, it's considered that an expense has occurred because transfer of the title has taken place, and therefore that value may not be used as a match. So you don't want to lose out on that. If you own property prior to the application, you just need to apply for development assistance. So the following must be included when you're applying for acquisition. Estimated value of the property, a legal description of the land, acquisition and boundary map or concept plan, properties to be acquired. If you're getting donated land, there must be a history of conveyance, and we'll talk about each of these. But also if there's any improvements on the property. Say you have capital improvements like buildings or ball fields. We've had situations where, for example, a Little League association was dissolving and they donated the land or sold the land to the local government. In that case, there were some buildings, like restroom buildings, pavilions, picnic shelters, and ball fields on the property. So in that case, they were going to be continued to be used for recreation purposes. But we also want to know about any capital improvements on the property, if you plan to demolish them or have another use. So those are all part of the acquisition process, which we'll talk about. So when we look at property value, the appraisal must be completed by a licensed North Carolina appraiser. They must be certified with Universal Standard of Professional Appraisal Practices. So the appraiser must be qualified to do that, and they must certify that the appraisal was done using those practices. So those are the methods used. You need to provide 2 copies of the appraisal, 1 copy and 1 original. If the property is valued at $750,000 or higher, you must get 2 appraisals are required. In those cases, the state property office will review both of those appraisals to determine what the value of the property is that you will use for your application. Also note that on your cost estimates, if you're doing, remember, appraisals can be an eligible expense if you list them on your cost estimates. PARTF also, but keep in mind when we talk about these appraisals that PARTF funds may only go towards property purchased at or below fair market value. So if you pay higher than the fair market value than the appraisal, so the appraisal's $350,000, but you paid $450,000, PARTF is only going to allow the appraised value of $350,000 to be in your budget and what you will be reimbursed for. So if your application is funded, you will be responsible for paying any cost overruns. That includes you had to pay higher cost for the property or other items. So it's very important to make sure your request is as close to actual value as possible. Especially true if you're not getting an appraisal ahead of time, like before your application. So you want to make sure, and you want to make sure that you're for your citizens of your jurisdiction that you're spending money effectively and wisely. So tips, what you're looking at the appraisal. What is the date of the appraisal? Is it recent? Are you using the tax value of the property? If so, when was the last reevaluation done? Is the seller's asking price in a reasonable range? So those are all things to consider. Legal description of the land. This is described in the application, usually meets and bounds or a survey that you'll see in the example on the image on the right. You need to have project title, acreage, north area scale, the date prepared, who prepared it, all as part of your map elements. And again, this is in the application. Easements, if there's any easements on the property, like I have a power easement, sewer easement, or there are restrictions on public use of the property. Those are things that might be in the deed, so check those before the property is transferred to you. What is adjacent property use, and any significant reference points. And here's, well, before we get to that, we also want you to include, with the boundary map, a concept plan. Again, use the color coding required through PARTF to illustrate your proposal. It'll have the site boundaries, proposed use of the property. And again, the concept plan is not a final master plan or as-built, but it gives the authority an idea of what you're proposing to build on the park. Especially if you're doing acquisition only, they want to know how is this going to be used in the future. Looking for compatibility for the location and type of recreation that the land can support. And here's a map showing, so this was an example where there was an existing park and they were able to purchase property here on the right to expand the park. But in this case, they were not doing development. It was acquisition only to expand the park. So in the application, they have the property boundary in red with green showing the acquisition. But the entire park is larger, so it's also in red. But they showed the future development in orange. So again, this way when the Park Authority looks at it, they know, like, oh, okay, they're going to tie into their existing trail system, add some camping, and some access to the river. So make sure you include all of those. And again, your RRS consultants can review any plans that you have and give you some tips on working with that. So another page is looking at the list of properties for acquisition. You need to complete this for each parcel proposed as part of the acquisition, as part of the PARTF application, what you're asking for funds for. So again, the applicant, the title of the project, and there'll be 4 options for how the property will be purchased. So you'll just enter that in each of these lines. So it will be either purchased, so that would be fee simple, donated, required donation, and each of these are down here at the bottom if you look at these references, or bargain sale. So you list that for each parcel, current owner, the parcel number, acreage, and then you want to give it the estimated value for the land, and only include improvements for public park purposes if they're on the property and they will be used for that. So if there's improvements that will not be used for the park, sometimes land has been donated that might have an old home on it, that's just going to be demolished, so it's not going to be used for public park improvements, so it's not included. And also make sure if the value of the property or excuse me, the capital improvements that are on the property that will not be used as public park, that value, if it's included in the appraisal, must be removed from the value. So again, then you will have the proposed purchase price and total these up. And again, your RS consultant may help you with that, and just take a look at the examples they have in the application. So again, donated land, you must provide a history of conveyance. So that's copies of the deeds from the past 5 years. So we want to make sure that it wasn't like in public hands last year, given to somebody else, then donated back to the local government. Deed restriction, any land purchased with part of funds must be dedicated for public recreational use in perpetuity. So that's forever as a public park. So there's exact language that must be used on those. So that's included in the application. It shows you, but be aware that as you're doing the acquisition process, that will need to be recorded with the deed, and that deed restriction included. You will actually submit the deed and that deed restriction to close out the project when it includes acquisition. And if you're doing acquisition only without development, know that public access must be provided within 5 years of the purchase date. So PARTF isn't good if you're just going to land bank and not develop it for 20 years. The Park Authority wants to award acquisition when the land will be used in the near future for the public to access. So do you need to take title to the property earlier? So if you need to purchase it prior to having a signed contract, you can't wait. You can request a waiver of retroactivity. So this type of waiver will permit the purchase or value of the property, even if it's being donated. It allows you to take title prior to a contract being signed, and will help it be eligible as a part of expense. If you have this scenario, please contact your regional consultant to discuss it and make sure you follow all the procedures. When this takes place, the waiver must be requested in writing prior to purchasing the property, so you can't already have title to it. So you need to request it through a letter from the local government on their letterhead, explain why the waiver is necessary, give a legal description of the property, explain why it is an important part of the recreational infrastructure for your jurisdiction. Also include a statement that indicates you recognize that if the waiver is approved, and it gives you no special treatment in any way to assure your application will be approved or funded. If the waiver is approved, it will be good for 24 months. So that gives you 2 grant cycles. If you're not awarded 1 year, you can go back and still have that donated property or the purchase of that property, the acquisition of it, as an eligible expense. So this is if you're purchasing it, or even if it's donated, and you must take title, you need to request a waiver, do that through your RRS consultant. And again, the urgency, must be there. If not purchased at this time, the opportunity to buy this for public recreation will be lost. So it has to meet that urgent need to be approved. Thank you, and that's all we have for our acquisition video.